know me will know that I am a passionate reader. I've been a reader for 18 years and I feel very, very strongly called to being a reader in the Church of England and all that that means in my particular ministry. And what that means in my particular ministry is to be a teacher of the faith. So when we were beginning to have a conversation about the future of reader ministry and what that might look like, I of course became really, really animated about the strand around being a teacher of the faith. And I just want to spend a few moments telling you why I'm so passionate about it, why I think it's a really exciting development, and then I will dash away and you can have a conversation about whether you agree with me or not. Right at the heart, I think, of the Christian faith is an expectation of learning. So the very first thing that Jesus did in his ministry was to call disciples. And some of you will have heard me say this before, but I will say it again many times. The word disciple comes from the word to learn. So a disciple is someone who learns. So the very first thing that Jesus did was invite people into a learning relationship. And then the very first thing that he sent the disciples to do was to proclaim the kingdom. So having learnt, he sent them to teach. And it seems to me that right at the heart of the Christian faith is that expectation of learning and teaching and learning and teaching. And for me, right at the heart of what we're called to do and be as readers is to be people who model that discipleship circle of learning and teaching and learning and teaching. It's why reader training is so very important, because it is about shaping our learning in the faith. But it is also, I think, one of the things that we're primarily called to do, which is to be people who teach the faith. Historically, that has taken a variety of forms, but in more recent decades, it's kind of focused down into a more recognisable and single form, which is the preaching. And many of us who are readers hugely enjoy the opportunity to do preaching. But one of the suggestions around this future of reader ministry is, what might it look like? What might it feel like for those of us who are readers actually to broaden that understanding of being people who teach the faith into being people who are deeply involved in catechesis of all types and forms and shapes and levels? If you cast your mind back to the very earliest church, you will remember that catechesis is right at the heart of the early Christian church, that teaching of the faith to new believers. The catechesis role was a really very, very significant one. And for me, one of the really interesting questions is, as readers, how could we recapture that ancient catechetical role of being people who pass on the faith? You may also be aware that one of the things that I've been involved with in recent years is the Pilgrim Course. The Pilgrim Course being based around 4 of the key pillar documents of faith: the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes and the baptismal promises, as being the pillars of understanding the faith. We've finished the Pilgrim Course a few years ago and have recently, very, very recently, just brought out a tiny booklet called The Pilgrim Way, in which we've tried to set down the principles of Christian faith in that. You might also be interested to know that Bishop Martin and I are involved in trying to do a youth pilgrim course. Well, nearly succeeding, in fact, in doing a youth pilgrim course, again based on those 4 pillar documents of the early teaching. And as a result of getting involved in the discipleship courses, in the catechesis for the 21st century, and in the Youth Pilgrim, I have become more and more passionate about why it is really important for us as a church in the 21st century to understand, firstly, the content of our faith. When somebody says to you, why is the good news good? Being able to be easily and confidently able to explain why the good news is good news and not just general news. So there's something about the content of faith. There's also, I think, something about the mechanism of how you communicate the faith and how you go about doing it. The striking thing is that when Jesus did his teaching and the disciples did their learning, they used a first century model, one that was hugely familiar to anyone who lived in Judea in the first century. I think the really fascinating question is, what does a 21st century model that looks like the first century model look like? What do we need to do? What do we need to use? What kind of methods can we use that can set up that learning and teaching relationship? And one of the things that Gertrude is going to do in a moment is talk about some of the dreaming that we did together when we were trying to answer that question. What does it look like in the 21st century to be people who learn and teach the faith in an active way? So I, for one, am hugely excited about the possibility of exploring what reader ministry might look like if it becomes more focused around the teaching of the faith, the understanding of the content, the becoming expert in the communication methods of communication. Preaching will of course always remain up there because it is one of the most important elements of the way in which we do teaching. But what if, as readers, we became experts in all sorts of other ways of communicating the faith? Could we, as a reader movement, dream new and exciting ways of communicating the good news and communicating that the good news is in fact good? And I think there is something in that which for me is very exciting, and I shall look forward to hearing the results of the consultations once Bishop Martin's been around the country.